I think part of what we should do is go over the history.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start. So why don't you tell me, I have whatever I have here, but I don't, I would rather hear your description of the history of it. Because that's the way I've been getting the information so far when I sit down with people. I'm like, all right, tell me about it. And they just kind of go. Obviously I'm not saying, I'm not force you to ad-lib. But yeah, if you can just tell me your...
Sure. Peterborough first adopted zoning about 50 years ago. I think it was 1970. And over the years, there have been a lot of changes, a lot of things added. But at its base, when you talk about the residential districts, it's about the same. And it's typical small town zoning, close to town, multifamily allowed, half-acre lots, further from town, 1 acre lots, further still from town, rural district, 3 acre lots, and that's unchanged. And the planning board realized that there needed to be some changes to modernize. And part of the reason was when zoning was instituted in Peterborough and then some of the changes along the way, it was intended to slow down development because New Hampshire was growing so fast. It was scaring people. We don't have that problem anymore. And so now we need to find a way to have zoning that's not simply meant to be a roadblock, but that helps to create the town that people want. So the planning board's answer was the traditional neighborhood overlay zone number 1, which came along in 2014. And then they followed up 3 years later with traditional neighborhood overlay zone 2 in 2017. And the way the planning board explained those amendments, both of them, is they said, we want walkable communities, we want new housing options, we want more affordable housing, we want to make efficient use of infrastructure. That was how they talked about it.
I mean, those all sound like things that everybody wants.
Those are definitely things that everybody wants.
Okay.
The difficulty that has come up after the fact is that they were talking about their goals, which were everybody's goals. They didn't talk about how their amendment achieved those goals. They didn't talk about what their amendment actually said. And if they had gone to the voters in 2014 and 2017 and said, we think we should amend the zoning in Peterborough, reducing the lot size, minimum lot size to 1/8 of an acre, and reduce the setbacks to 5 feet, and introduce some commercial uses and apartment buildings into single-family neighborhoods, the amendments never would have passed. But the planning board never talked about the details, and that was a disservice to the town because we didn't actually have that conversation in Peterborough until 2018 when they came up with their next amendment, which was going to combine the 2 overlay zones with the underlying zones and create pretty much a whole new ordinance with all of those changes that were subject to permits in the overlay zones. The tiny lots, the much smaller setbacks, the smaller frontages, expanded uses allowed. And then we had the debate in Peterborough about, is a 5-foot setback too small? Is 1/8 of an acre too small? And the planning board lost big, almost 3-1. After that, people who were part of the Committee for Sensible Zoning went to the planning board and said, we'd like to work with the planning board on an amendment for 2019 where both sides could agree, figure out what is the right density, what's the right setback, what's the right lot size for the different neighborhoods in town, and let's involve the neighborhoods in this too. Mm-hmm. And the planning board said, we're not interested. So then the committee got together and said, well, then we're going to propose an amendment of our own because we don't want this to sit for another year. So that's where they came up with their amendment, which went on the ballot by petition for 2019. And they decided on several changes. First change was to repeal the second overlay zone. They thought about eliminating the second overlay zone and simply expanding the first overlay zone so it took in the second and just made one overlay for everything.
And this was with the consolidation in 2018.
No, this is what they were discussing
In 2019.
in 2019.
I didn't get that from the bill at all. I'm just
saying,
curious.
no, I'm saying this is what they considered. They didn't put it in. I was just explaining the thought process.
Okay, sure.
So they considered this, but what they realized is if you look at overlay zone number 1, it's got 2 parts to it. It's got the general residence part and the family part. And so then the lot sizes are different and the allowed uses are different, depending on whether you're on Pine Street or High Street, which is family district, or if you're on Grove Street, Summer Street, Concord Street. You're in general residence, Granite Street, your general residence has different rules.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of the funny thing about the ordinance the way it is now is that overlay 2, which is the further out neighborhoods,
Yeah.
is less restrictive than overlay 1. For example, in overlay 1, pretty much no commercial uses are allowed. Overlay 2, commercial uses are allowed. Overlay 1, if you're in the family district, Pine Street and High Street, multifamily not allowed. But if you're in overlay 2 in the family district, Kaufman Drive, Lookout Hill Road, multifamily is allowed.
So here's my question for that. Like,
So let me just finish the
Yeah,
thought
yeah,
here.
yeah.
So finally they said, it doesn't make sense to expand TNOZ I out to more neighborhoods because there isn't a whole lot of difference between the current zoning in the family district and family district within TNOZ I. The big difference is the minimum lot size. And that committee decided, rather than get into a fight about what's the proper lot size, let's repeal TNOZ II, and then for 2020, maybe the planning board will be willing to talk an amendment where we have a discussion in Peterborough about what's the appropriate lot size in the family district.
So I have a bunch of questions. I think the first question I really want to ask, and I mean, why have a minimum lot size at all? I guess, for me, I think about it in terms of, okay, we can, it's one thing to look at what's written down on paper, and we can talk about, okay, well, you can do this, or this type of development is possible, right? But I wonder, at what point does it actually play out in a way that is detrimental to our community? So I guess when I read over TNOZ I and TNOZ II, right, currently as they're written, they say within them pretty explicitly that just about anything that you want to do has to get approval. Like, you can't just go ahead and do some stuff, and everything is going to go through town approval processes, right? So that means that whatever your development is getting audited, and in both of those bits of code, it says pretty explicitly it has to conform to pre-existing building types. So right away it's saying, okay, you can't do something that looks outrageously different from whatever we have already. So I'm wondering, isn't that kind of over-regulating at a time where the town really needs to expand and needs to not be doing anything to restrict its ability to grow? Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
So the purpose of zoning is so that you don't have incompatible uses next to each other, and so that you have a town that looks the way you want it to look. And
Explain that to me a second. When you say looks the way you want it to look, who's the you in that?
so before we had zoning in Peterborough,
Yeah.
we had developers who did Blueberry Lane, who did Glen Drive, who did Kaufman Drive and Cheney Ave and Orchard Hill Road, who did Pine Ridge. And I think in all of those neighborhoods, the developers put covenants in the deeds that had basically the same objective as zoning. it specified people couldn't subdivide their lots, so the lot they bought was the minimum lot size they could have. They couldn't go smaller. They couldn't cut their lot in half and do 2 houses. They couldn't put an apartment house. It's in the covenants. They couldn't have tiny setbacks. It's in the covenants. And so the idea is you create a neighborhood with a certain look. And then, and I would argue that it makes a town stronger, more prosperous, if it's planned in that way, with different neighborhoods with different looks, so that Union Street is expected to be denser looking than Orchard Hill Road, because that's how they were laid out. And
so, but I hear that, and I have to ask, doesn't that kind of insinuate that we want to sort of section off, okay, those of you that can afford a single family multi-bedroom home, say 3-bedroom home, you can live here. And then those of you who can't afford that can live on this side of town. And then those of you who want a really large house, we've got spots for you out on Windy Road. So to me, that seems like a type of segregation by class. Do you think that's an incorrect read?
I think if you drive around Peterborough, if you drive on Windy Row, if you drive on pretty much, all over Peterborough, you find a mix of housing everywhere. There are little tiny houses on Windy Row. There are great big houses close to town. And so I don't think it's the segregation that you're talking about. It's a segregation as to look, not necessarily as to money. And so if somebody wants to build a little house on a little lot in Peterborough, they can do it on the in close to town neighborhoods.
Sure, I guess the thing is that, increasingly in today's world, look is tied to money. I think for me as, I'm 30, and I make personally less than $50,000 a year. Look is not something that I have any say in when it comes to where I live. But this is my town in terms of, I was born here. I was born in Monadnock Community Hospital. Aside from going to college, I've lived here my whole life. And I don't like the idea that in my own town I would be told by somebody else, well, these are the places that are acceptable for you to live because we value the way something looks over who's here. That, to me, that's sort of an implied suggestion. And I want to make, if that's not the case, I want to make it clear that it isn't. But that's a concern that I have.
So, well, I like I said before, I don't think that's the case in Peterborough, that there are different housing types all over town, little houses on big lots, big houses on little lots, and all the other possibilities. And so, if you're looking in the under $200,000 price range, you can live in almost every neighborhood in Peterborough. There aren't a whole ton of options, but there are options all over.
Right. And so we're getting to options now, right? So the idea of, if we want to create more options in town, right? Wouldn't increasing the setback requirements increase the required lot size in general? Because, right, like you say, you can't build a house with footprint X small, right? So you're restricted to losing 15 feet on every side, or 15 feet up front, and I think 10 on the sides is what it would go to. So for the same size house, you would need a larger property, which increases the value of the property, which means it's more expensive to live there, right? So by increasing lot sizes, I'm having a hard time seeing how that would make more affordable options.
So I think you have to go at this analysis neighborhood by neighborhood. So if you look at the existing single-family neighborhoods in Peterborough, whether it's Pine Ridge or Glen Drive or Blueberry Lane or whatever, they're half-acre lots, three-quarter lots. For the most part, the setbacks are 25 feet.
Hold on one second.